Hello and welcome back to our second video lecture for Module 3 of Secondary Ed 419. The wonders of online education is that I'm sitting in my living room right now. It's late at night and I'm able to record this for you, and it's kind of cool that we get to do things this way. So I hope these have been at least as interesting as reading more articles. So now it's time to pick over and talk a little bit about the archetypal approach to literary criticism. The archetypal approach is something that has shown up in curriculums over the last few years. I actually wrote a big unit on it for Baltimore County back in the early 2000s, and we put it in 6th grade, and then it was developed in 7th and 8th as well. I know now that the kids actually start talking a little bit about the hero's journey in 5th grade in Baltimore County, and I'm sure other school systems do the same. The archetypal approach is a very interesting thing for students to pick up as they start to analyze literature. For us, I'm introducing this along with Percy Jackson because Riordan has actually, in interviews, acknowledged his thoughts about the archetypes in the designing and planning of Percy as a story and as his characters. And we're going to talk about those archetypes and how they can be applied. One of the biggest things I've seen with teaching archetypes to kids is that they are able to apply them when they struggle with a story. Once the idea of a story becomes difficult, it gives them something to lean back on. If you've never read Joseph Campbell or Christopher Vogler, I think that you'll enjoy this concept both as an English major and a person who loves literature, but I hope you'll see the value of it for your students as well. We're going to talk about character archetypes first, and we'll do plot archetypes in a different video lecture. And the character archetypes we're going to talk about come mostly from the works of Christopher Vogler, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So first we define archetypes, and when I work with this with the kids, this is actually the presentation I used with my 8th graders this year that I'm using as my PowerPoint slides. So forgive me if they do seem a little middle school oriented. I wanted you to see the way I teach this to 8th graders, and of course as I talk through it, I'll be focusing on it for you as adults. But I wanted you to see that this is something that kids will pick up on. The idea about the archetypes are that they are a common repeated concept or idea in literature, film, video games, etc. And with the students, I always harp on this. This is not a book thing, guys. Anytime somebody's told a story, this archetype idea pops back up. And something about these concepts, if you look at the research that has been done in archetypal approach to storytelling, is somehow vital to everything that's ever been told as a story. It gets seen throughout and over again, coming back from our earliest myths and leading into stories that are written this year. It's something that we keep seeing over and over again. One of the arguments that proponents of the archetypal approach like to float out there is that pretty much every story either matches the archetype consciously or consciously rebels against the archetype. That's a pretty big statement, and when you're talking about the archetypal approach to literary criticism, it's a big statement for your kids to think about, So if they're not matching the archetype, has the author pointedly decided to go against it? And the biggest example I give with this is Shrek. I teach irony with Shrek, and I like to talk about going against the archetypal ideas with Shrek. This is Vogler's quote that comes right out of one of his works on archetypes. He talks about ancient patterns of personality that are the shared heritage of the human race. This is why this just resounds, why it seems to show up in every story, because these are the patterns that we kind of show as a people that pop up over and over again. Character archetypes, when we talk about them as a mask. And this is a cool thing for students as they start to analyze character. Because when we talk about archetypal mask, it can be put on and taken off by different characters throughout the story. Therefore, the archetype is the role, not the character themselves. So if we take a character, like Harry Potter, for example, it's easy when you're just kind of looking at Harry to say, oh, well, he's the hero of the story. But the honest answer is not always. Because Harry takes that mask and passes it around. Sometimes Ron wears that mask. Sometimes Hermione wears that mask. Sometimes Dumbledore wears that mask. And it's the idea that the role is the mask. I always like to talk about a mask with my students. A mask has an outside, what other people see, and once you put it on, it really shapes how the world views you, as these archetypes do. Once a character wears an archetypal mask, it shapes the way that the story has to deal with them. But just like a mask has a front, it also has a back. It has a set of things that is pressed against the character, a set of things that the character now has to deal with, requirements and expectations that come along with that archetypal mask. good old Mr. Ninos did not make this up. This actually comes from some pretty extensive scholarship that's going on over the years. Carl Jung, of course, the Swiss psychiatrist you all learned about in Psych 101, and he's the one where a lot of this kind of founded the collective unconsciousness, the idea of dreams and myths and religion and philosophy. That gets passed on to Joseph Campbell, who writes prolifically about mythology in the 60s and 70s, going right on into the 80s, and he proposes the idea of the monomyth. He looks at comparative mythology and he says, why do cultures have stories that line up? And he argues that there are certain storytelling expectations that are just part of us as human beings. And his idea turns into the hero's journey and will be something that we'll see in the plot archetypes as well. I tend to stay away from Campbell with my students and use kind of my own mishmash of him and Vogler, simply because Campbell's ideas can get to be a little specific and also a little more vague and lean towards the psychiatry of this concept of archetypes more than the literary aspect. But if you've never read The Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell, a little light reading for the summer. I think it's only about 550 pages. You don't have anything else to do, right? Just kidding. But Campbell's writing is excellent, and it's something that all serious students of literature should really read at some point in their career. So the first archetype that is proposed is the idea of the hero. That word comes from the Greek. The idea that the hero is there to actually sacrifice, to be there for the good of others. Oftentimes we'll just identify this as the protagonist. The idea that we have a hero character in a story who is usually the one that we're going to connect with, the one that we're going to see. The hero then represents our own search, the search that we have. We've already identified this as a key component of young adult literature, that the hero mask is the person that we're meant to connect with. They're our eyes. They're the person that's going through that search to become a whole or complete human being. I'm going to talk a lot about Wizard of Oz in this presentation. It's one of my favorite movies, one of my favorite plays, and it's one that really connects with kids. A lot of kids have seen the movie. They're able to talk about the movie. And Dorothy Gale, as a hero, is a fascinating character. The mask that she puts on to become the hero of the story. She doesn't wear it throughout that entire story, but she's searching. She's searching to find out who she is, to become complete. Beginning of the story, she's very incomplete. She's very unhappy. She's not sure of her place in the world. Sound like any teenagers you know? Heck, that story was written back in what, 1920-something? Probably should have done my research before I started recording. Heroes should have universal qualities that we all can identify. They should be things that we can look at and say, I see a little bit of myself in there. But yet a hero should still be original. They should have flaws. They should have talents. We look at young adult literature. Our heroes, we want them to be real. Our kids want them to be real. They can smell a fake hero. They won't like that book. They won't connect with that book. They'll pull a Holden Caulfield and talk about fakers and not be able to stand them. The idea that we really want to figure out a hero who is real. And our writers have worked on this and created these real characters. I know not everyone's read the Harry Potter series, but I'm always amazed at how well Rowling can write the teenage brain, especially when she gets into the 5th or 6th book. And she really captures so well the way a teenager thinks and the anger that flares up from nowhere over small things. The hero mask causes someone to grow and change. When they put it on, their journey is going to cause them to change. That part gets pressed against them. And a hero is therefore responsible for the plot and the action of the story. Sometimes heroes are going to combine masks. They may wear another mask for a short period of time. As you look through all the different masks in our story, in the presentation tonight, think about heroes who wear both of them. And the idea that the mask can be crisscrossed and can also be passed around. We could talk about different varieties of hero with our student, willing versus unwilling, group-oriented versus loner heroes, the anti-hero, especially as we get into later high school and we start to have stories where we have to analyze a character who's not very heroic, but still is forced into that role. And of course, the idea of the tragic hero, the hero who's being set up for that fall. This is a slide for my students. We usually talk about who's going to wear that mask in various stories that we've read so far that year, that they've read in earlier grades. And I always throw around the superhero idea because, superhero creators are smart guys. And the idea of the mask was not ever an accident, right? Because when he's not wearing the mask, Spider-Man is Peter Parker, Batman is Bruce Wayne. It's when they put the mask on that they become the hero. Without the mask, they are not. That mask, that symbolic donning of the hero mask is what makes them into that character. And I think that superhero creators understand this. And when they create these separate personas for their characters, they show that archetypal understanding. I always laugh at the kids. I said, there's one hero who puts a mask on to be normal and not a hero, and that's Superman. He hides his face to become normal as opposed to becoming the superhero. And whether it's intended or not, it's a great way for students to remember those masks. The second archetype we're going to talk about in this presentation is the mentor, the wise old man or woman. You'll see some crisscross now with your signpost, right? Word from the wiser. We can connect that mentor archetype to them. And the mentor's job is to teach and protect the hero. They're there to give the hero knowledge, to give them gifts, to help guide them on the path. The mentor often represents a hero who's already completed their journey. Whether it's been successful or not, that character, that mentor character, has already finished a journey of their own. A lot of times they're what the hero aspires towards, or maybe what the hero doesn't want to end up as. They represent the parent in that story. And we think about how we want our stories to kind of mirror the lives that we ourselves are living. Those mentor characters represent those parental figures, those people we could turn to, the people who have already succeeded in their journey, the people who are there to guide us and care for us. The mentor's job is to provide motivation, conscience for the hero. They're there to plan information to help the plot move forward. But one of the key ideas behind the mentor, when we look at the archetypal approach, is that they just cannot finish that quest with the hero. And this goes back to the fact that they represent the parent. If we're thinking about the archetypes mirroring our own lives, our mentors will never finish our quest with us. Whether it's on the surface level of, when you're in school, your teachers will not move on past the grade that you're in, or whether when we talk about the parent and the bigger part of life, it's a very hard acknowledgement to make, but our parents won't always be with us. And the archetype of the mentor, the archetypal mask, shows our heroes that, and shows the readers that, shows the viewers that those mentors will not be always there to guide us. At some point, the hero, the self, is going to have to step on the road on their own and do it for themselves. Another superhero slide for my students as we go forward, talking about the mentors, the idea that they are there to guide their heroes. The third archetype is the shadow, often representing the antagonist. The idea that the shadow represents the dark side of the hero, the unexplored, the repressed, the unwanted. All the dark things we don't like or even want to admit about the hero, and therefore by transference about ourselves. You ever notice how smart George Lucas was when he designed the visual of Star Wars? Look at Vader for a second. Spoiler alert, Darth Vader is Luke's father. Just going to put that out there for you. But look at Vader's costume. It's a shadow. It's very loose on hard forms. And the other thing about Vader's costume, if you look into it, and this picture doesn't do a great job, is you see yourself in it. It's reflective. When Luke looks at Vader, he sees his own reflection in Vader's helmet. The idea that the shadow is reflecting the hero, a twisted reflection, but a reflection nonetheless. And the idea that the shadow is the failure of the hero. The shadow's job is to challenge the hero and to show them, hey, if you're not successful, this is what you will become. Lord of the Rings fans, if you think about Gollum against Frodo, the idea that if Frodo cannot overcome the ring, he will become Gollum. That is what his ultimate fate would be if he is not successful in his journey. Comic fans, the same thing against Batman and the Joker. The idea that Batman himself runs the risk of becoming that crazy villain. The idea of the shadow of his own self. The shadow isn't always totally evil. A lot of times in young adult fiction, we get very sympathetic antagonists, very sympathetic shadows. Shadows that are hard for a character to look at. When we get away from the hero's journey style novels and we get to something that's a little more realistic fiction, that shadow character really is almost a mirror of the protagonist, a mirror of the hero, but just with those small things that the hero realizes aren't quite right. John Green writes incredible shadows into his book, and if you ever get to read any of his novels, maybe as part of your final project for this course, it's an interesting analysis to see how he holds these characters up against his protagonist so that they learn about themselves. Sometimes the idea of a sympathetic hero, or sympathetic villain, is much more terrifying than an inhuman villain. Know your Disney. I think I said that in one of the replies earlier. Scar really is a sympathetic character. course, the Lion King is just Hamlet with lions, but still, the idea that you have Scar, who is the brother that was never able to rise up. He was never able to take his own role. People have looked down on him his entire life. He's not purely that despicable villain. Even in Rowling's work, she makes Voldemort slightly sympathetic as we look into his past and we get the idea of what it was to be Tom Riddle. The shadow is a mask that can be worn by other archetypes, maybe even by the hero, him or herself, for a short period of time. We get into a hero versus self type conflict. Isn't the hero wearing their own shadow mask? Aren't they in struggle with themselves? Again, that concept of the archetypal mask that can be passed around, the idea of internal conflict. Again, I always love looking at visual design. The Wicked Witch of the West, look at that shadow that's there. The way she's presented to Dorothy, the way she's presented to the viewers. That costume itself is so archetypal. The idea it's the shadow costume. There's my comic book slide. I hope some of you are comic book fans. I hope this isn't getting totally lost, because it is really kind of a neat thing that comic artists do to acknowledge archetypal characters. On the left is Spider-Man and his enemy Venom. And look at that costume that's designed for Venom. It is the shadow, the distorted feature of Spider-Man. And the character very much plays that role in the Spider-Man comics as a distortion of who Spider-Man is. In the recent Avengers movie, Age of Ultron, put my pointer over there, Ultron is a twisted Iron Man. And in that movie, it of course is Tony Stark that brings about Ultron unto creation. Our next archetype is the Threshold Guardian. Threshold, the idea of a crossing, of something that has to be passed. I teach this to kids. I stand in the doorway and I talk about crossing a threshold, and then I have somebody stand in my way. These are the characters who stop the hero from moving forward. It's a very open archetype. They can be a minor enemy. They could be an ally. They could be a challenge. Dorothy meets the three companions on the yellow brick road on their way to Oz, and when she meets them, they are Threshold Guardians. She meets the Scarecrow. She doesn't know where to go. Which way do I go? This way or that way? And after much dancing and falling down, he's able to help her on her journey. She has to meet each of them before she can move forward. The Threshold Guardian archetype has something that the hero needs. The hero either needs to learn something from them or about themselves, or they have to take it in. The Threshold Guardians exist to make the hero whole. And as you read Percy Jackson this week, look at his friends and how they contribute to him discovering who he is. He has to meet each of them along the road of his journey, and he has to somehow manage to bring them in. Look at Harry's own journey in Harry Potter. Ron and Hermione are needed for Harry to be complete. Malfoy's a Threshold Guardian as well. Harry has to overcome him in order to learn who he really is. The question of the Threshold Guardian is, can the hero transcend the challenge? Are they able to move past it? From a literary standpoint, the Threshold Guardian's there to reveal weaknesses in the hero. This is my cute Cyclops, because I usually teach a little bit of the Odyssey in 8th grade, and I just always think he's kind of cute for somebody who eats men wholesale. So I'll put him in my PowerPoint presentation. The idea of that Threshold Guardian showing up over and over again in the story. Remember, it's a mask. Multiple characters can wear it. Multiple ideas can put it on and take it off. I talk about having non-characters actually wear a Threshold Guardian mask if a character has to overcome a physical obstacle or an obstacle within the environment. That can be a Threshold Guardian as well. The next archetype is the Herald. And the Herald's job in a story is to announce something to the hero. They're there to bring great news or terrible tidings. They're there to bring information to the hero themselves. Of course, since I'm talking to 8th graders, I do lean on Star Wars as much as I lean on my superhero slides. But think about the droids in Star Wars, for those of you who've seen the movies. Their job is to bring information. They're the ones who reveal what's happening. They're the ones who show up and say, this is what's going on. They're responsible for actually sparking so much of the plot. The Herald's job is to observe, to chronicle, to provide motivation, and to give that cry for change. If our stories are about change, feasibly every story is, then the Herald's there to continue to make sure the hero knows that they have to change. When Dorothy shows up, the Munchkins are able to observe, to chronicle what she has done. They inform her about the world that she's entered, and then they point her, they motivate her, they point her on the road. When Glinda shows up as a mentor archetype in Oz, the Munchkins are there to watch and to see everything that happens. A little bit of Greek mythology, of course, talk about Hermes as an archetype, and there's my comic book slide with the Silver Surfer. The idea of heralding things that are to come. The Shapeshifter is a fascinating archetype, and it's an archetype that really gets played up in young adult fiction. The idea of a character who's wearing this mask, who changes constantly, not only from the hero's point of view, but from the reader's point of view. The idea that they're going to change not only appearance, but also roles, motivations, loyalties. A lot of times these are love interests that our protagonist is not quite sure how they feel about them or how that character feels about the protagonist. Their job there is to keep the hero guessing. The Shapeshifter may change appearance, may change mood or motivation. They bring doubt and suspense to the story. Are they an ally or are they an enemy? We talk about the idea of a protean character taking on many forms. Oh, Stephanie Meyer, I read all the Twilight books so I could talk about them with my students. She gets her archetypes though, doesn't she? So here you have Bella, protagonist of the story, arguably wearing the hero mask, although she's not quite the strongest hero, one of my main faults with the series, but I digress. She's in love with two boys. Well, think about this for a minute, and this is how smart the archetypes can play. When you're in love and you're a teenager, that shapeshifter archetype makes sense to you because you're never sure how the other person feels about you. You're not sure how you feel about them. Think about Bella and Edward, Bella and Jacob. She's not sure how she feels, which one she wants to be with, how they feel about her. But then Stephanie Meyer doubles down on the shapeshifter archetype because not only does she have a love interest who's shifting in ideas and loyalty towards her protagonist, but she makes them shapeshifters themselves. Jacob goes from boy to wolf, literally shape-shifting, changing the way that we, the characters, view him, changing the way that Bella views him. Edward goes from boy to sparkly sort of kind of vampire thing. Anyway, we'll leave that one alone, but you get the idea. The shapeshifter is a flexible mask. It's a mask that can be worn by any character, often for only a short time. Hey, if the hero starts to doubt their own motivations, they're wearing the shapeshifter mask. You can take shapeshifting literally. A hero who has to disguise themselves wears the shapeshifter mask. Professor Snape is probably one of my favorite characters in literature, hands down. Not young adult literature, but in literature. But he's a great example of the shapeshifter archetype. We as readers don't know until the very, very, very end that it was always Snape, that it was always Lily, and we understand what his final motivations are, and I don't want to give too many spoilers away, so some of you haven't read, but we're never quite sure about what Snape really is about. Back to my ideas from different media for my students, the idea of Mystique in the X-Men movies. Her mutant power is to actually change her form, and in the movies, we're never quite sure whose side she's on. Jennifer Lawrence has played that character incredibly well, and we're never sure who she's standing up with. Going back to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, if you haven't watched it, you should. We should have a young adult TV series class too. But the character of Angel that Buffy falls in love with, we're never sure about the relationship, and guess what? He's a shapeshifter as well, a vampire that changes back and forth. Talked about the Nutty Professor and the idea of a shapeshifter hero in the Sherman character there. Next archetype is the Trickster. Little quote from Vogler's book. That makes no sense, and so do I. And there's Bugs Bunny sitting there talking about victory through hair power. The idea of a trickster archetype embodying energies of mischief and a desire for change. They're going to be your comic relief. They're there to bring the big egos down to size. It can be shared with other masks. The trickster's job in the story is to humble the mighty, to bring the story itself back down to size, to not let us take the story too seriously, to not let us take life too seriously. Trickster's there for comic relief. I already said that, I think, but they provide perspective on difficult situations. When Anna goes through the worst part of Frozen, it's Olaf who's there to guide her through it. He's able to bring her to understand what's really going on in her life. A lot of times, tricksters are catalyst characters. They cause change, but nothing happens to them themselves. They could be an ally of the hero, they could be an ally of a shadow, or they could be independent of both, actually serving chaos itself as they move forward and continue to keep the story moving and changing. Some talks about archetypes also included an extra mask, and that is that of the ally. And this is a mask that's kind of a placeholder. It's something that if a character's traveling with the hero and they don't have anything else really to do, they'll usually wear an ally mask. And there's Luigi, the ultimate ally, who never gets to wear the hero mask and just follows Mario around. But the idea that it is a placeholder. And when you're talking archetypal masks with your students and getting them to think about them, it's useful for them to have this information. If you look at a team of people together like we will in Percy Jackson, once they are ceasing to be Threshold Guardians, Annabeth wears the ally mask quite often, and then she'll switch over to the hero mask sometimes to pull Percy's fat out of the fire. Same thing with Grover, and that gives a different idea of how that ally mask can be as a placeholder. So a fun assignment I do with my kids after I teach archetypes is to ask them to look at the characters in their own daily story and think about who wears what archetypes. I always get a very interesting conversation out of this with the students, and we can talk about who are the mentors in your life. Who are your threshold guardians? Do you have a shadow? Who's the shadow that is the reflection that you don't want to end up being? Who are the tricksters in your life? And then I often ask them to think about, okay, in other people's lives, what mask do you wear? Does viewpoint change a character? Well, I hope this has been at least interesting for you all. So take a little break, and we will go back with the third video lecture, which is going to talk about plot archetypes and the hero's journey.